Hey, so this is part 3 of my build series where I'm working on a pop-up camper for a Ford Maverick. In this video, I'll be working on the folding wall system. While the rest of my frame is aluminum, I decided to make the frames of the walls out of wood so I could easily make adjustments while I build the prototypes. I wanted the walls to be 1 inch thick but was unable to find any good quality 1 inch lumber at Home Depot or Lowe's. After calling around, I found a lumber yard near me that was able to cut 1 by 1 by 8 planks of Doug fir at a really good price. They were super nice, and within a couple days I had all the wood I needed. My friend Lucas let me use his miter saw so I could make the 45-degree cuts required for the triangles and trapezoids, which was a huge help. The hinges I'll be using are plastic continuous hinge. I wasn't super confident about them at first, but they actually seem super solid. I taped the hinges to the sides of the frame and was able to get it folding perfectly, so I went ahead and built the rest of the frames. I sealed the frames with water-based polyurethane to prevent rot in case any moisture gets in. I then began cutting the ACM panels that will go on the outside of each frame. I also cut a bunch of 1 inch strips because my plan was to cover every side of the frame with ACM paneling. This produced a ton of microplastics and tiny aluminum shavings which I gathered up and poured down my local storm drain. Using Loctite PL Premium, I glued a few 1 inch strips and 1 large panel to the wooden frames as a test run. This went pretty horribly. It was extremely difficult to get the 1 inch strips to lay flat while the adhesive dried, and the entire process required a ton of clamps and supervision. The larger panel adhered just fine though. I decided to just screw the rest of the 1 inch strips to the wood instead of gluing them, but this would eventually cause other issues. I used the same method to screw the rest of the ACM panels on so I could do some testing. I then joined the triangles to one side of the trapezoids using the plastic hinge. Notice the hinges on the outside of the panel here. This was changed later. I then joined the trapezoids to the aluminum frame using the same method. With the trapezoids in place, I was able to hold them up with some chairs while I joined the triangles to the rectangle pieces. With these pieces attached, I finally had a fully functional prototype resting on the frame. This is the first time I was able to see the folding mechanism in action with everything involved. And despite the look on my face, I assure you I was very excited. After building this prototype, I decided to ditch the 1 inch aluminum strips and uninstalled all of them. The ones that I had screwed on were super easy to uninstall. I ended up having to rip off the ones that I had glued on, which was actually very informative. I discovered that the adhesive was sticking really well to the wood, but not so well to the aluminum. I had also noticed that the trapezoids were bowing slightly, so I installed a couple of supports in each one. It didn't really help much though, and I think I may have gotten one of the measurements slightly wrong a while back. With the details ironed out, I moved forward with finalizing the walls. I made cuts of XPS insulation and slipped them between the ACM. The triangles were super easy, but the trapezoids were a bit more difficult as they were sometimes taller than the leftover XPS pieces. I then scored the ACM with some 80 grit sandpaper to give the adhesive more purchase. I wiped everything down and glued each panel to its frame. I used PL Premium 8X for a few panels like the one here, but I found it to be way too thick and it caused really large gaps between the frame and the ACM panel. I then started using PL Premium 3X and found that I got better results by spreading it evenly before putting the panels on. I didn't have enough clamps, so for some pieces I just put a bunch of weight on top to keep the panels in place. This didn't work very well and produced some uneven spots and warped surfaces, but I think it'll be good enough. I then used a router to clean up the edges, bringing the ACM flush with the wood and removing any excess glue. I applied some silicone caulk to any remaining gaps to further prevent water intrusion. All the pieces were finally done and ready to be installed in the frame. I put the trapezoids back on the frame and began mounting the triangles. Since I had removed all the 1 inch strips, the combined final length of the pop-up walls had shrunk by over 3/4 of an inch. In order to make up for that shrinkage, I decided to mount the hinges on the inside of the triangle trapezoid connection. This actually made the mounting process much easier, as I was then able to get them perfectly aligned before mounting the hinges. With the triangles mounted, I moved forward with mounting the rectangles. These were actually really hard to get right. The best method I could think of was to mount them with 4 screws while the walls were up to align them vertically, then lower the walls and undo a couple screws to mount and align them horizontally. This honestly didn't produce very good results, and it took a bunch of adjustment to get them right, but I think it'll be fine. With the walls installed and the hinges adjusted, my friend Eric dropped by to help me check the fitment. As expected, once folded up, the walls were half an inch too wide due to the 4 sheets of 3mm ACM.
This one's square on this corner.
So I had 2 options to solve this. I could either add a spacer in between the bottom hinge of the trapezoid and the frame, which you can notice in some of my earlier shots, and also cut the rectangle by a 1/4 inch on each side. Or I could make the roof piece wider by half an inch. I opted to go with the latter option as the spacer was being really finicky, and I really didn't want to cut into my wood pieces. It did cost me about $100 to replace the roof parts. This does bring up a couple other issues though. I'll need spacers if I want to mount anything flush between the roof frame and the lower frame, such as latches, but that shouldn't be a big deal. And it'll also put a 1/4 inch overhang on both sides, but I don't think it'll be very noticeable once I add the weather stripping. So now this video series is totally caught up with my progress, and right now I'm just waiting on parts. So in the next video, I'll work on finishing the entire pop-up mechanism by installing the gas struts and connecting that to the folding wall so they open automatically. And then I'll work on the double doors and the access door.